Leibniz's cosmological argument. And as you might recall, cosmological arguments for God, roughly put, try to prove that God exists by arguing that there must be a cause of the world. This cause must be God, therefore God must exist. So how does Leibniz spin his particular variation of the cosmological argument? Well, he has an interesting, or at least different approach. He begins by claiming that there are two principles upon which our reasons are founded. And he's laying out here the basic his approach to logic, as well as the foundation for his cosmological argument. So here's how it goes. First principle is what's called the principle of contradiction. And we use this to judge two things. The false involves contradiction, because, speaking from the standpoint of logic, a contradiction is a claim that is always false in virtue of its logical structure. The classic one being P and not P. Like, today is Thursday and not Thursday. It's impossible for that to be true. And there is, of course, the true, which is opposed or contradictory to the false. So the contradiction of the false would be the true. Now, Leibniz doesn't use the term here, but this in philosophy is what's known as a tautology, a statement that is always true. Like the statement P or not P. It is always true that today is Thursday or not Thursday, because it's either Thursday or not Thursday. And this is kind of the foundation of logic, or at least truth functional logic, that contradictions are always false and tautologies are always true. Now, in addition to his principle of contradiction, he also has his principle of sufficient reason. And here's how it works. He claims that no fact can be real or existent, no statement true, unless there be a sufficient reason why it is so and not otherwise. Now, he does note that most of these reasons cannot be known to us. So, crudely put, he's saying that everything happens for a reason, specifically a sufficient reason. So, how do we get from sufficient reason to proof of God's existence? Well, here's how it goes. Now, because we have, contradictions and we have sufficient reason, we get two kinds of truth. Now, I need to emphasize once again, because we live in an age where people talk about alternative facts and there being like different truths. But for Leibniz, when he says two kinds of truth, he doesn't mean that something can be true for someone but not true for somebody else, that there are alternative facts, alternative truths. He means that there are truths, and there's one type of truth that has a certain nature to it, and there's another type of truth that has a different nature, although they're both truths. So he's not saying that you could have a claim that is true and false. What he's claiming is there are two types of truth. And these truths are as follows. The first type of truth is what he calls the truths of reasoning. These are necessary, which means they must be true, and their opposite is impossible. To deny a necessary truth is to make a claim that is impossible to be true. The most obvious example would be, a truth of reasoning. The most obvious would be a tautology. So the claim today is Thursday or not Thursday is a necessary truth, and the opposite, the denial of that, would be impossible. Now he claims, and this will create a problem in philosophy that endures to this day, and both a problem to be solved and a problem in the usual sense of this is kind of not really bad, but something that's got to be worked on. He claims this. In the case of a truth of reasoning, its reason, the reason why it's true, can be found by analysis. And you might recall back to his method, which is taking things down to simpler and simpler parts. And he believes you can analyze a truth of reason. and resolve it to more simple ideas and truths until reaching what he calls the primitive ideas. Now, not primitive in the sense that they're living in caves and running around with stone, axes, not in that sense. Philosophically speaking, in metaphysics and other branches of philosophy, a primitive means something that you don't analyze. You leave it in a way unexplained. Now, this is something that you pretty much have to do because if you go back to the infinite regress, you can't analyze for infinity because you'd be off in an infinite regress and you'd never complete it. And this is when we talk about the skeptics in the next part, it's one of the arguments they use against knowing stuff, that you can never, achieve, this explanation. It goes to infinity, so you can never know. But Leibniz believed you could analyze things down until you reach something that cannot be analyzed anymore, that you hit, the bottom. This is also something that's done not with like truths, but also with things in physics. Because one of the projects they're working on in physics is trying to keep breaking things like in superconducting supercolliders until you get the fundamental entities, whatever they are. And they would be the primitives of physics, things that cannot be broken anymore. Now, as I mentioned, this notion of analysis created a problem in philosophy. Not just something to be solved, but also this is causing a lot of trouble and conflict. And this notion that you could analyze things and find within it these truths becomes something that later philosophers fight about, and many later philosophers say this is just a metaphor, an empty metaphor, which does make some sense because we know what it means to say analyze, say, a blood sample to see if there's a virus present. We know what it means to analyze water to see if there's lead present. But what would it be to analyze, a truth, in the sense of we could talk about it, etc. But what would that even mean? And other people say, oh, we know exactly what that means. We're talking about it. We're analyzing it. So the truths of reason are necessary. Their denial is impossible, and we find their reason through analysis. That you can essentially find the reason within it. Now, what about the other type of truth? Well, these are truths of fact. And again, Leibniz is not talking about alternative facts and true for me, but not true for you type of stuff. It's that truth is truth. It's just that there are truths of reasoning, like triangles have three sides, and there are also what he calls truths of fact. These are contingent, which means that if they're true, they're an actual true fact, doesn't mean they must always be true. And their opposite is possible. To use an obvious example, think of the day of the week. It is true when I'm recording this that today is Thursday. But of course, tomorrow won't be Thursday. So that today is Thursday is obviously not a truth of reasoning because Thursday is only Thursday on Thursday. As another example, that Donald Trump won the presidency would be a contingent truth because it's not a necessary truth, but it's a truth of fact. It's true that he is president, but it's contingent because he didn't have to win. And of course, eventually, because of term limits, he won't be president anymore, unless the term limits get extended. But eventually, even, of course, time will pass, and eventually there'll be another president. So those are truths of fact. They're contingent, and their opposite is possible. Likewise, that I'm alive is a contingent truth. I happen to be alive now, but the opposite of that, me not being alive, is certainly possible. So there are truths of reason and truths of fact. So what about this sufficient reason stuff? Well, here's how this works in more detail. With the contingent truths, he claims there must be a sufficient reason for contingent truths, what he calls, again, truths of fact. So everything happens for a reason, everything is true for a reason. Now, you can't find the reason for a contingent truth by analyzing that truth. Again, whatever the analysis might mean. So, for Leibniz, the series of things in the universe of created objects would be these contingent truths. So, for him, the resolution into a particular reason, why am I alive? Why is Hillary Clinton not president? Why is the COVID virus here now? The resolution into any particular reason for anything might run into detail without limits, as he claims. Why? Well, because there's an immense variety of objects, and there's a division of bodies, what he says, ad infinitum. Things split up, incredibly. Now, how does this get to God? Well, it seems like we've gone far off track, but we're on the way there. It just seems like we're taking a long trip to God. Now, whenever we give a reason for something that's, another truth of fact, we're given just another contingency. And each of those truths of fact that we give in the explanation, they too need to be examined to see why they're true. And we just keep on going and going and going. For example, take a basic example. Why am I, in Florida? Well, got a job here. Why did I get a job here? Well, I happened to be here when they were hiring in 1993. Why was I here in 1993? Well, I had graduated. Why did I graduate in 93? Well, it took that long to get through grad school. Why did it take that long? And we could keep going and going and going, all the way back to when I was born. And then, of course, you could ask, why was I born? You could talk about my parents meeting, and then you could say, why are they here? You could go to their parents, and you could go all the way back. And so this just keeps going and going. And for every contingent truth, you can always ask, why is that true and not false? And so what we need, according to Leibniz, because as you might have guessed, we're off on an infinite regress again, the ultimate sufficient, the final reason must be outside of this series of contingencies, however infinite it might be. And as you might have guessed, the final reason of things that answers the question, why, he claims, must be found in a necessary substance, which again is a being that not only exists, but must exist. So why does that stop the infinite regress? Well, again, go back to the example, of me. You could trace me back to when I was born, and then, of course, you trace back to my parents, and then beyond my parents, my grandparents, great-grandparents, etc., all the way back and back and back and back. And you still haven't got an answer because there's still just more questions. Why that and not this? Why this and not that? So what we need is something where it doesn't make any sense to ask the question, why is it this and not that? And Leibniz claims this. God doesn't change, but he kind of does. And this is a weird philosophical concept because they're all kind of weird. But there's this notion of what's called eminent containment. And the idea is this. One thing that medieval thinkers ran into was this problem with God. Namely, to use one example of this, God is not supposed to be a physical being. So then how does he, physically interact with the world? And one solution they came up with was, well, God has the powers of being physical eminently. This is a fancy term for having a quality or feature or property or power as if you had it for real, but you don't actually have it for real. So you could have the power, God could have the power to move physical objects without being a physical being. To use a technological analogy, if you've I'll give a couple examples. One is if you have a Macintosh computer and you want to run Windows. One way to do that is to use an emulator where you run something like Parallels or another program, and you can run Windows on your Mac as if it's as if it were running Windows. It's not actually running Windows, it's running Mac OS, but it's emulating the Windows PC. Now, of course, you could also just run Windows on it like a PC. Or another example, if you're into like retro gaming, you can download programs that let you emulate things like older gaming systems, like old Nintendos, or if you're really old school, back to those old arcade games. And so even though if you're running it on, say, your computer is not an old, Pac-Man arcade, system, but it's able to run the game as if it were. And so having something eminently is like being able to emulate it. You can do it, but you're not really that thing. And so it's a way to do the thing without being the thing. And so in the case of change, God can't change because he's perfect. But then the obvious problem is that how does he do anything? How does he make anything happen? Well, the workaround is he never changes, but he changes eminently. In other words, he can act as if he changes, but he never changes. And this is a God's superpower, in a sense. So, in the case of God, the answer is you don't need another contingent truth. Because if you say, why, the answer is God. And if you say, why did God do this? And the answer always is, that's what God is. God does that because he's God. He would not do otherwise. So, in God, the substance, he is the sufficient reason of everything. And Leibniz says, there is but one God, and God suffices. So, roughly put, super condensing this down, basic idea is this. Okay, there are some truths that are contingent truths. And you can always ask, why is this true and not false? Like, why is there this virus now and not the virus? Why is it here? And you give a reason as to how it originated, but then there's the question of, well, why that? And then if you give an explanation, there's why that. Like a kid always asking why for every explanation. And you could do this forever, because it'd always be, if everything's contingent, there's always a question of why. And then Leibniz says, well, if this goes on forever, there would be no reason. So you need a being, God, that is the reason for everything. So ultimately, why anything? God. Now, as you might gather, using my example of the virus, that this would seem to make God responsible for bad things. So also the good things, like, why is there ice cream? God. Why are there puppies and kitties? God. But then why is there the coronavirus? God. Why is there genocide? God. And that leads us into what is called the problem of evil. And Leibniz, part of his claim to fame, is working out some really unique and interesting replies to the problem of evil. And we'll turn to that next.